Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Justinian and Theodora Part 9, Justinian's Rival by Extra History. Now last week we saw as Belisarius was recalled from Italy to take on a Persian invasion of Byzantine territory in the east. Today we'll be seeing how that plays out. Now before we get into this one, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. It is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
A comet crosses the sky. For 40 days and 40 nights it lingers, growing brighter, longer, then at last fading from view. It's an omen for empire. Its course is the course that all empires take. In Byzantium, sages debate its meaning, but its meaning would soon become all too clear.
True, though that trajectory for the Roman Empire was much longer than most. I mean, its rise and fall took a very, very long time if you're counting from the beginning of the Roman Republic until the end of the Eastern Roman Empire, the fall of Constantinople.
Hunnish and Bulgar raiders had let loose a storm like never before seen. Their incursions into Scythia Minor and Thrace had grown. City after city was sacked. Twice, Roman generals were defeated in the field, and the horde pushed all the way up to the Anastasian Wall, a bare 40 miles from Constantinople. Crops were left unattended.
Yeah, though there were several times throughout Roman history where it looked like that might come to an end much, much sooner. I mean, seriously, the Roman Empire could have ended a full 1,000 years before it actually did.
Massive portions of the population were enslaved. The economy of the nearby provinces was in ruin. Tax revenue had dropped, and the infrastructure would take years to rebuild. But this was only a temporary threat. Barbarians retreat, raids come and go. And though this one was of the likes not seen in decades, it only served as a prelude to the events that would follow. For the real threat was in the south. A border dispute had flared up and become an open conflict amongst client tribes of the Byzantines and the Persians. These two great empires weren't at war, but the ancient world stood on a knife's edge. Justinian had to send somebody to pacify the situation, but Belisarius was still in Italy, and with him were many of the empire's best troops. So he sent a man named Cetus, who had been in the region.
Yeah, well, this is what happens when you're running this massive empire. And not only do you have to defend your existing borders, but you're trying to conquer new territory. You might end up in a situation where you desperately need troops in one area to the east, but a lot of your best men are being taken up in the west trying to reconquer Italy. You know, there's a lot to balance, and, you know, Justinian very well knows that. He is one of the emperors who balanced probably the most ambitious projects at one time, but it's still a problem that he's going to have to face.
Region ever since the First Persian War, where Belisarius had won fame at the Battle of Dara. And at first, all went well for Cetus. He tried to win the people to his side, and it worked. A tribe known to the Romans as the Aspetiani secretly sent envoys to Cetus to plead with him to let them remain free if, on the day of the battle when he went to put down the rebellion, they would abandon their rebel border tribes and join his force. Eagerly he accepted, thinking that this would be a route to a bloodless victory. When the Aspetiani switched sides, it would demoralize the other rebels, and when they saw how great a force they now faced, might even persuade them to come to terms. And so he had his promise inscribed on tablets of clay and sent by messenger to the Aspetiani. Then he readied his army for the battle. But on the way to confront the rebel forces, some of his outriders encountered a small group of Aspetiani and slew nearly all, either not knowing of the bargain that had been made, or not understanding just who this group of rebels was.
Yeah, that might put a bump in the road. That might hamper the agreement made between the two groups.
But some of these men escaped and made it back to their tribe. Shortly thereafter, Cetus cornered the rebels and prepared to fight them in the blasted Armenian hills. But the messengers he'd sent had taken other roads, and his army had outpaced them. So no tablets offering peace, and no promises of safe passage ever reached the Aspetiani.
Yikes.
Only news of the death of their comrades and their kin. And so the Aspetiani stayed with the rebels, their resolve to fight now insurmountable on account of the betrayal they thought had occurred.
Yeah, so not only did they not get the offer that was supposed to reach them, but what did reach them was news of an apparent betrayal and slaughter of their own people. So we've done a real 180 here. what seemed like, this little trick, we'll get some of their own guys to betray them, has gone in the complete opposite direction.
The battle was fierce, and it was personal. The rough terrain didn't allow for the elegant movement of armies, but instead split the fight into 1,000 small actions settled by bravery and skill at arms. And in this chaos, Cetus was isolated, and in his isolation he was recognized by the Armenians and struck down.
Oh.
And so Justinian next sent a man named Bozes to deal with the rebel Armenians. And Bozes invited them to treat with him, asking that they send their powerful men to speak about terms. The Armenians were distrustful of the Romans, but there was one among them, a man named John, who knew Bozes and trusted him, and so convinced the rebels that they should ride out and treat with him. But when they arrived, John's son-in-law saw that their meeting point was surrounded by the Roman army, and so begged John to leave. The rest of the group heard John's son-in-law and left. Only John remained.
Damn.
But for reasons that are still not clear, Bozes slew John, and when this became known, John's son-in-law...
Well, John's son-in-law was exactly right, hey? He was like, hey, this is a trap. We gotta get out of here. And everyone else listened, apart from John, who was then promptly killed. So, not some great diplomacy going on from the Romans, I gotta be honest.
Law went to Khosrow, the energetic and able king of the Persians, and pleaded that he join the war. And in truth, the war may have already had his hand in it, as ever since Vitiges told him of Belisarius being tied up in the west, he had wanted a reason to attack the Byzantines.
I mean, look, you've got these two big empires, the Romans and the Sassanid Persians. If there's any sort of conflict going on nearby, they usually have some involvement. And by the way, we get to Khosrow, King of Kings, leader of the Sassanid Persians. We've done an entire series on him. We've reacted to extra history series on him, so I'll link that, down below and in the top right corner, so you should check that out if you're interested. But in many ways, his life and career sort of paralleled Justinian. They were both these deeply ambitious and successful leaders who, led their empires to, quite impressive heights, while neither of them being perfect. They both faced challenges and failures, but they seemed to have sort of a similar thing going on at the same time.
And now he had it. The great king marshaled his forces and drove into Byzantine territory. But rather than savage conquest, he had a better plan. After all, sieges were such a terrible waste of men and material. Instead, he would drive his massive force up to a town, pop in with his envoys, and let them know that for the low price of a huge amount of gold, he wouldn't burn anything or loot anybody or kill anyone. And for the most part, the towns agreed to this deal, which seemed like a far better bargain than being sacked after attempting a defense they couldn't possibly sustain. And this method of bargaining freed Khosrow to move north like lightning, collecting from town after town on the way until he reached Antioch. Here, the city decided to resist. Khosrow's force rapidly overwhelmed the defenses, but cleverly, he left one gate to the city open and unguarded. Seeing a chance for escape, the entire Byzantine garrison took off through the exit Khosrow had left them as soon as things started to go south. And here, Khosrow showed he wasn't playing around. He captured all the citizens, stole all the wealth, and then leveled the place to the ground. At this point, Justinian decided...
Yeah, Khosrow, he was an effective ruler. He was one of these guys who would do what it took to achieve his goals, but as you saw, he could be pragmatic, and, he could be more peaceful at times. If it called for it, he could also be very violent. He sort of, at times, took advantage of those who were dissatisfied with Justinian, dissidents of the Byzantine regime, and he would sort of invite them into his sphere of influence. Play this sort of magnanimous figure who was willing to support the arts and education and all that sort of stuff. And, he genuinely was. Of course, you can debate why exactly he wanted to do that. I don't think anyone ever really has pure intentions. He was obviously competing with the Eastern Roman Empire, but he definitely, portrayed himself as this more magnanimous, learned figure. Even though, as we saw, he could definitely be brutal and violent when he felt it was necessary. Look, you're leading this giant empire. That's sort of part of the job. You've got this massive military apparatus. you're the aggressor in this situation, it's probably going to take a bit of violence here and there. Not every victory is going to be bloodless.
It was time to treat with Khosrow, who asked for thousands of pounds of gold and an annual tribute to go away. But Khosrow wasn't done. Until messengers came back with his gold, he was going to continue his Raid the Byzantines party. But first on his to-do list was to take a lovely swim in the Mediterranean to show just how far the Persian Empire had come, just like the Persian heroes of legend. When he was done with his...
Yeah, this was a big thing because, the Romans were masters of the Mediterranean world, and though this Roman Empire, this Eastern Roman Empire that we're dealing with, is no longer master of the entire Mediterranean, it is the most powerful Mediterranean state at this point. That will, fade at some point. But it's still seen as sort of the Mediterranean power. And, the Persians, they've always been a little bit to the east, and they've always loved reaching the Mediterranean, conquering territory around it, if they could. Even just getting there, it's always been a bit of an FU to the Romans, being like, we're in your territory, we're in the Mediterranean, isn't that your thing? We'll take a lovely little swim. It's kind of rubbing it in the Roman psyche a little bit.
Brief dip. He commenced part 2 of Operation Stick It to Justinian. In the next town he came to, he actually paid for a chariot race in the Hippodrome, but stipulated that the Green Rider had to win, because after all, as we all know, Justinian was a super fan of the blues. After this
this is the kind of, he's trolling. This is the kind of thing where Khosrow is giving money for the arts and sports and all that kind of stuff, but oftentimes he's doing it directly to spite Justinian, or at the very least to benefit at Justinian's expense, or to benefit at the Romans' expense. I remember in the series we did on Khosrow, he also did this, as I said, in regard to dissidents of the Roman Empire. Intellectuals who weren't satisfied with Justinian's rule, or, maybe they weren't satisfied with the religious order, or whatever it was. Khosrow would give them the whole, hey, we're open to scholarship, we're willing to fund you, just come to our empire. So, he did a lot of that kind of stuff.
Masterclass in trollsmanship, messengers finally arrived from Justinian, agreeing to the terms. But Khosrow decided, why let a little agreement get in the way of a good extortion campaign, and proceeded to do the same thing he'd been doing basically all the way back home.
Well, all of this had begun despite the fact that the Romans and the Persians had signed this, eternal peace, so-called eternal peace, that was, as the name suggests, supposed to evermore cement peace between the two great rivals. That hadn't lasted long. I don't think either side really respected it that much. If Khosrow hadn't been the aggressor, I can bet you that at some point the Romans would have been. But Khosrow, he was like, meh, eternal peace, who cares? Let's go in there anyway. So you can bet that he's going to work around any deal that's presented to him.
Although, in part 3 of his Stick It to Justinian master plan, when the citizens of Kari came out to offer him money to go away, Khosrow was like, hey, don't sweat it, bros, you're pagans, we're cool, and sent them their money back. Finally, he thought...
That's what I'm saying, the whole magnanimous king-type character, especially in that case, and I mentioned that, some religious dissidents, found some refuge in Khosrow's empire. Now, they may not have been pagan, may have been a different denomination of Christian, a different type of Christian, other religions, but some of them would have been pagans who were dissatisfied with the, Orthodox Christian order of Justinian, and, all the emperors at this point, and Khosrow was like, yeah, totally, come to us, once again portraying that magnanimous, generous emperor-type figure.
Thought he'd take a shot at capturing Dara along the way, but in the end was repulsed, and settled for, as usual, a bit of cash to keep moving. Oh, and you remember all of those captives that he took at Antioch? Well, he was never able to sell them back to the Romans, so instead of selling them into slavery, like basically any other ancient ruler would have done, he had a different plan. You see, before razing Antioch to the ground, he'd had his engineers take copious notes on how the city was laid out, and when they got...
Yeah, this is one of the really curious projects that Khosrow undertook, because your typical military leader or emperor, like they said, would have enslaved these people and then sold them back to the empire to slavers. I mean, it's horrible, but that's the reality of it. That's what would have been done. But Khosrow had sort of an unusual, different idea.
Back to Persia, he had them create a new city for the Antiochians, exactly like the old one. And he named it Antioch Khosrow, or literally, Khosrow's better version of Antioch. Style points. But as hilarious as all of this was from...
So he essentially took these people, and I guess just to stick it to Justinian and the Romans, rebuilt their city, moved them there, essentially deported them from the Roman Empire to his own, and then settled them there. Which is a very unusual project, you know, another piece of masterful trolling, and though I'm sure these people weren't super happy to have their homes destroyed and then be displaced, you gotta imagine, imagine the world that we're in at the moment. The alternative is being killed or sold into slavery, and instead you get resettled in the Persian Empire. It's honestly probably not such a bad deal compared to the alternatives. You probably feel like, you know what, this could have been a lot worse.
On the Persian side of things, for the Romans, this exposed many of the weaknesses underlying their mighty empire. Weaknesses which caused their allies to begin to doubt. Soon, Lazica, the province just south of the Caucasus Mountains, tried to switch to the Persian side, and war was on again. But...
yeah, well, as we've seen with Armenia and this territory now, the Caucasus Mountains area was always a bit of a borderlands between the Persians and the Romans. Armenia is sort of the main state in that equation. It was always this country in the middle that... the Romans and the Persians always had a lot of influence over it. It couldn't escape their spheres of influence. But because it was in the middle, it also had a lot of influence over them. It could sort of play them against each other. And so this was a territory that was often competed over. And of course, its sort of status as this middle borderlands territory did continue through history. I mean, the Caucasus Mountains region has often been... the site of competition between multiple empires.
Finally, Belisarius was back. He organized a raid into Persia, and although not a resounding success quite like many of his other endeavors, it was successful enough to force the Persians to withdraw from Lazica for the season.
Yeah, you know how it is. As we said earlier, typical empire stuff. You've got your best troops occupied somewhere else, so that allows your enemies, your rivals, to wreak havoc in one corner of your empire. But whenever you get the opportunity to call those guys back, you've got a much better shot. In this case, we're talking about Belisarius. As we've seen, that man could essentially accomplish anything. I mean, this is, he's known as sort of one of the great Roman generals, I think, for a good reason. You sent him out to achieve something, he would probably get it done. I mean, he had literally been sent to reconquer Roman Africa and Italy. So those are some pretty big goals, so send him back to go take on the Persians. As he had done earlier in his career, he's definitely the guy for the job, and it finally gives Rome, and Justinian in this case, a bit of breathing room. Though, with Belisarius out of Italy, now some problems might start to pop up in those western territories, right? So it's always a balancing act.
The following year, though, the great king returned. This time, Khosrow was aiming at Jerusalem.
Whoa.
He arrayed before him a mighty host, far greater than that he'd rode with before, and began to harry the borders of Palestine. Though Belisarius had done the impossible...
Antioch's an important city, but Jerusalem, that's a step up, you know what I mean? Especially, of course, in religious importance. But even beyond that, it was just a generally important city for the region.
And time again, this was probably the end. When he had defied the odds, he'd always found an advantage that he could magnify. Strong walls, more disciplined troops. But now he faced an empire with soldiers hardened by war, well-disciplined, well-equipped, led by energetic and capable men.
Yeah, we've seen Belisarius has had conflict with the Persians in the past, and, it's not like he's been fighting easy opponents, right? You don't want to make it out that in Africa and Italy he was fighting chumps. That's not true, but keep in mind, he kind of is facing a higher caliber of opponent here. He is facing another great empire with a lot of men and resources to marshal. These troops have a lot of experience, they're well-disciplined, they're well-trained, much like his own soldiers. They're being led by talented people, and at, the top of it all, the Persians have their Justinian equivalent in Khosrow. Ambitious, daring, decisive. This is a tough foe to take on.
Faced a force beyond any he could muster. And yet, he resolved to fight, though it would be his life. And so he gathered men to him, all he could rally. This would be a fight like no other, and if he were to die, it would be in service to the Empire.
Belisarius was never known to step down. He's not that kind of guy. I also think at this point, we've seen there's been a bit of drama between Belisarius and Justinian. I think, in my opinion, most of it is due to Justinian's suspicion and paranoia, some of which might be justified, but I wouldn't blame Belisarius for it necessarily. Maybe he could have acted a little more cautiously, but we've seen that drama. I think Belisarius also knows that he has to prove himself. He has to prove that he's still loyal. And also, I think, there's that. It's also even more genuine than that. I think he genuinely was loyal to his emperor, to his empire. So he wanted to prove that he was, but he actually was, and he was willing to show that.
If he were to die, it would be with glory. And each day the Persians drew nearer. Each day the horde of the great king moved inexorably closer. Then they stopped, and they withdrew. Some may say that it was because they feared the great name Belisarius, but it was actually because of something much darker.
Yeah.
Whispers. A horror on the periphery. A killer of men.
Uh-oh. Yeah, I mean, there's, sometimes you do hear that it's Belisarius' name and reputation that scared them away, and I don't know, there might be some truth to that, but as was hinted at the end, or just stated, we're moving into a new era defined by a terrible scourge that is falling upon the land that will really change the fate of beyond the region, but definitely the Persian and Roman empires. So we've got more to come. But yeah, I had a good time with this one. We've got a bit of a crossover with the Khosrow series, which, like I said, I will link that down below at the top of the description if you want to check out my reactions to their videos on Khosrow. He is a fascinating figure in his own right, and in some ways similar to Justinian, so, there's a lot of parallels there. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is also linked down below. Now, with that out of the way, I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.